space and cover off what the model produces on red flags related to spending by function or purpose and inputs and outcomes. I'll conclude with the main findings and next steps. I'll just go past this statistics reviews. So since this paper is placing corruption as a form of inefficiency to make it a fiscal space issue, we need to define efficiency within that context. And there are many different definitions and types. Economists have their views, auditors have their versions, accountants have their versions, all similar but different. And I'm focusing on three of the common economist versions, so allocative efficiency, distributive, and technical. Now, corruption affects all three of these. So we can misallocate resources on purpose to give money to the wrong policies as cover for corruption. And you can distribute money to the wrong people and wrong groups who use it poorly with corrupt intent, so that's distributive inefficiency. And you can pay way too much for what was bought, and you don't collect enough from what was supposed to, or things of value were given away too cheaply, technical inefficiency. But to understand, to answer the third question, we need to understand what the difference between what corruption is and what it isn't. Because that's at the heart of the sensitivity issue when doing budgets, and there's a reality there. So for me, we need to understand the difference, what I call political manoeuvring and corruption, because I think that's at the heart of it. And I have some definitions I'm proposing to help in this area. And these are the definitions. So here we've got political manoeuvring. It's defined as the use of power in an effort to gain or retain political, social, or economic outcomes in the public interest, whereas corruption is the abuse of power in an effort to gain or retain an advantage for oneself, someone else, or some other group, private interests, a self-interest issue. Now, these power elements, it's important to understand the sources of power. Now, in my research, I focus on the administrative part, how the public finance systems are used for corrupt intent. But there are other sources of power: electoral power, political power, executive power, judicial, communication, academic power, professional qualification, star power. All these powers can be used in the public interest or abused for self-interest. And this gets to the heart of the enduring challenge universal challenge of this clash of the public duty values clashing with self-interest instincts. Go a lot further, but that's we'll move on. So moving on to the heart of the paper. So this is the fiscal space section. I'll quickly explain to you what you look at the figure here. This is the Heller fiscal space graph. It was invented by Peter Heller from the IMF in 2005. It was designed to help visualize the age-old problem of where to get money for government priorities. You can raise taxes, you can borrow money or sell assets, you can get other people to pay for things, or you can become more efficient by doing more with less. Now, the fiscal model works by calculating what is available in the four dimensions. Now, tax is done as a proximity to a tax target as a percentage of GDP. Balance sheet, debt is done as a proximity to debt to GDP threshold. Grants was normally done by proximity to an absorptive capacity threshold for low-income countries for the efficient use of aid. But for the US, it's different. I used proximity to non-US country targets for NATO spending and for official aid disbursements, both as a percentage of US GDP. And then the estimates for efficiency was from the model, the estimates of losses from corruption, expensive political manoeuvres, and other inefficiencies. So that's how it works. So what does it say? Now, this is just one scenario, so it has the three assumptions. One, a low tax target of around 20% of GDP, I think it is. Very strong borrowing capabilities and high NATO defence and aid targets. Now, under that scenario, it shows that there's no more room for tax to use the tax to get more money. No more room for debt because they're already at limit. There's some money available from NATO and aid, but the big money is in efficiency. $1.4 trillion of it in losses, worth 6% of GDP and 16% of general government expenditure. So that's what it says. Now, here are the drivers, some of the numbers that are underpinning those numbers. And it's good to just have a quick look at that. So what we see here at the top, we start with the blue line. This is the tax to GDP ratio. It's basically flat. The downturns are basically driven by economic shocks. You have 9/11, global financial crisis, COVID. It hangs around 20%. Aid is at the bottom. OECD aid as a percentage of US GDP is fairly low and steady. There's NATO here, spending, but this is the big problem for US. Big increase, massive increase in aid very quickly over a couple of decades. 9/11, global financial crisis, bit of Iraq and Afghan wars going on there, and COVID. It's quickly exploding above 100% of GDP. Now, this orange line is the losses from inefficiencies. It goes down, but it's very sensitive to risk estimates. So it may not be due efficiencies coming down, but better risk data coming up through the years. Now, moving on, this is what I call the follow the money corruption cycle. This explains where that $1.4 trillion comes from. Now, there's a few things here. So this cycle was designed to show three things. First, how public finance systems work in an ideal world of when efficiency drive things, an ideal but not real world, efficiency drive things. Second, how public finance systems work to facilitate corruption systems. And third, how they help with political manoeuvring. So just let me quickly summarise one of them, that is how it works for corrupt systems. So we'll start at the budget. Just be frank. So here you pay for your budget rather than based on policy. So you pay for a budget, then you pay to access. You get your commitment to access the cash. Then you pay to win the contract. You pay to change the contract. You pay to verify that the road was built when it wasn't. Then you pay again to get paid. Then you pay to clear the order irregularities that are all through this process, whether they're real or not. Then in personnel system, you pay for your position, and then you pay again to retain your position. On the revenue side, you pay to reduce your tax obligations. On customs, you pay to have low valuations at the border. On the extractives, you pay to direct them to vested interests. On fees and fines, you pay to avoid them. Grants, you pay to direct them to a vested interest as well. On the counting side, you pay to cover your tracks. On the balance sheet, you pay to get cheap access to public assets and favourable treatment of debts. Plenty of billion-dollar examples of billion-dollar debts being written off or assets handed over for nothing. And then if you get picked up for any malfeasance during this process and gets sent over to one of the accountability organisations, then you just pay again to get to clear the referral. So that's how it demonstrates how corruption works in public finance systems. It also shows, the model shows where those losses are. And for the US, 1.4 trillion, the losses are in the budget in where the money is being allocated. Now that 1.4 trillion sounds a lot, and it is. But compared to other countries on a percentage of GDP and a percentage of expenditure, it's actually very good. US is one of the lowest in these metrics. It's just that the US is so massive that these numbers are so big. The original paper has the world league tables that has US doing very well, and the new paper has the G20 league tables, these things. So it may look big, but it's actually not that bad. Now, there's a lot of risk data that's underpinning that model. And I just want to show you one of those, some of the metrics that I find interesting. And this is what I want to show you. In public finance land, we talk about budget credibility and budget reliability. These metrics show how accurate a budget is. It compares budget to actuals. Now, those terms, budget credibility and reliability, are really just code for ideas like corrupt budgeting. There can be many reasons, but if it happens all the time, then the budget is more likely to be like an auction. Now, a budget auction is where you hand out resources based on a willingness to pay rather than based on well thought through policies, evidence, and assessment of all the trade-offs of all the different uses. Now, the data I have for the US up to the turn, you can see up to the turn of the century, the US had a very credible and reliable budget. When the federal government set a budget target, they met them. But after the 2000s, after 9/11, everything changed. Budget credibility fell off a cliff, never to be seen again unless for a brief moment in 2013-14. Now, deeper inspection reveals there are indeed big problems in the way the budget is put together, but much more work is needed here. We don't have the time. Just looking at some of the key metrics that come into this and some of the flags, I just want to talk to you about this. So this is when we're looking at doing our trend analysis of what's in the model. We look at 4 dimensions: US dollars, percentage of GDP, percentage of revenue or percentage of expenditure, and per capita. They all tell different stories. And the country comparators here are the G20 +5. But what's the main message here is that there's a massive net worth problem. So US has massive negative net worth, over $20 trillion negative net worth. UK is the same, major outliers, and it's driven by massive debts, massive deficits, and low investment in infrastructure. There are asset valuation issues, but it's fundamentally a debt problem. If this is the tax side, we're looking at one of the dimensions of fiscal space. You can see China tagging closely with US as in terms of tax take, but that's not the main point. The main point here is US tax take is high in nominal and per capita terms, but it's low to moderate as a percentage of GDP and revenue. But it's also a very high growth country, so there's a tax growth issue there. So when you're talking about fiscal space. On the NATO side, NATO spending is rising, so fiscal space is declining. On aid spending, official aid is up, fiscal space is down, and it's small anyway. Now looking at the sector and some aggregates, there's a lot, there's deep dives in each one, but the main findings coming out of it: the social protection system is big and inefficient. US hard and soft power projection is declining. Hard power is defence, soft power is aid, it's declining, while China is actually dominating in soft power. No efficiency metrics yet, there yet. Public order and safety is declining in funding and is a state-driven function, and no efficient metrics there yet. Education is big and is actually quite efficient. It's a state-run function. 95% of it is paid for by the states, but it's in decline. It's going in the wrong way at the moment. Health is massive and inefficient with big federal-state coordination issues. It's a 50-50 financing share between the two levels of government. On inputs, we've got salaries, big, but 73% of it comes from the states. Social benefits, big, 40% of it is total general government expenditures. Interest payments are big, it's $1 trillion, 10% of general government expenditures, and that's squeezing out capital spending, which is low. And deficits are financing a whole heap of current expenditure as well. So on all these, we've got plenty of red flags. Another interesting finding that
Andrew, we're just about at time, just to let you know.
Okay, 2 minutes, 1 minute.
Yep.
One last one, interesting finding: there appears to be a link between loss of trust in institutions and corruption, a particular link between corruption and the public finance risk that we've seen. Here we've got Congress, trust in Congress going down, political parties going down, trust in civil service going down. From a public finance perspective, it's the consequences of not doing anything about all that corruption and expensive political moves that get stuck in the budget. It's like toxic waste that you just can't remove. Anyway, just to close, the main findings: government is big and messy. US is the biggest and no different. We need to see corruption within the context to everything else, include political maneuvering and other forms of inefficiency. The efficiency for the US is close to being the only remaining source of fiscal space, so solving the corruption and expensive political maneuver problems should be a priority for both parties. Debts, deficit, and investment problems are big, but the big risks there's also big risks on the solutions, so QE, inflation, and growth. Tax is non-starter from a policy perspective, and there are growth issues, but there are composition issues in there. Third-party payments, NATO and aid, important but small. And when we do the analysis, the red flags across the 4 levels, so macro, fiscal space, sectors, inputs, and the budget cycle, all problematic. So next steps, do some more research, finish off the case study, do some more peer reviews. When you start looking at this from this perspective, the response options open up a bit more. So there's lots to be done there. And the third paper that will be coming out was on fiscal intelligence tools using public external data. There's other work we're doing with private confidential data with different data sets within governments that are also very important to talk about, and they'll be next. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Hope you enjoyed it.
All right, we're going to go ahead with Q&A right now. So if you have a question in the room, raise your hand, or online, please feel free to put your hand up or throw it in the chat. Yeah, got one here. Here.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for the presentation. I don't know if you can come back to one of your slides. You were making a difference between something that could be deemed corruption and something different that is political maneuver. And the criteria that you were using was, for instance, wrong policies, wrong people, etc. To me, this concept of wrong policy, for instance, could be very politically charged or has a value content. So my question would be like, how would you define this difference between corruption and political maneuver?
I'll just have to get it. But so that's a fundamental question to understand what the difference between political maneuvering and corruption is. So the classic example I give for that is President Lincoln. So, and the classic example is when he was fighting to abolish slavery, and there's a classic line that he says. So he's short 2 votes to get the slavery abolished, and he talks to his team. He says, he gets up. I am the President of the United States, clothed in immense power, public finance power. You will procure me those votes. And they knew what they meant was, you will buy these votes. You will go out there. You will give these people whatever they need. Their projects, their $100 million projects there. You'll give the customs commissioner to this person, all that sort of stuff. But you will buy me those votes. Classic stuff. And it's written as the ends justify the means. And in that case, the intent was not for private interest. The intent was in the public interest. He believed it was in the public interest. And I think most people, or some people, would disagree with the methods. They would say that was a political maneuver where the intent matters. So, and we've got lots of examples. So, but if we can't appreciate the difference of intent, what's a political maneuver, playing chess, or with all these people, different parties trying to get hold of the resources, and corruption, which is intent for private use to make for the advantages of others at the expense of the public, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to get corruption targeted in a systematic way through the budget process. And I just add that once you start looking for it, it's not hard at all. It's there. The data is right through the system. The problem is having the right environment to be able to do it in a safe and systematic way.
Okay, great. We got a question online from Heidi. Have you differentiated between financial condition versus fiscal condition when evaluating the fiscal space? And if so, I think, do you think that different times will impact the budget cycle? Are you thinking of the political budget cycle and the fiscal space?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm not quite understand the question, but does timing matter for the fiscal space? Yes. So, and this is what I think there is an issue in the US. If you keep doing budgets during the year, what happens is there's this idea in public finance, there's a single budget process where you do it once, and when you do the budget once, you're trading off all the different competing policies, all the different competing interests, and then you make a choice of making sure that you're getting the best bang for your buck out of the allocation. So that's the efficiency line. If you break that up all the time, you introduce different bills that have fiscal impacts, and you package bills up for all the different competing, it becomes an auction. Literally, it becomes, we're packaging up the thing so that here, all these veterans are getting dealt with at this part of the year. We'll do it again another year. And that's exactly what explains, and possibly what explains why the credibility of the budget, the US budget, fell off the cliff at the turn of the century. So timing does matter, and there is this cycle that I think seems to work, but there's more research warranted, I think.
Okay. Any other questions here for Andrew?
If anyone gets other insights or questions, please do contact me. I'm very keen to get some feedback and get pushed on some of this stuff.
All right, Andrew, thanks for sharing with us. Fantastic. Let's keep moving.
Thanks so much.
Okay. All right, so next up we have Lucio. Am I saying that right?
Yes, Lucio Picci. Yeah.
Lucio. I knew I was close. Lucio, this one going to be a lot of mispronunciations. Hang in there. Lucio Picci, University of Bologna. This is going to be embarrassing. Bologna. Compliance and leakages in international regimes, the case of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. Lucio Picci is a distinguished researcher specializing in corruption and distributive politics. He earned his PhD from the University of California at San Diego under Nobel laureate Dr. Robert Engel. His influential work appears in prestigious publications, including the American Journal of Political Science and the Review of Economics and Statistics. He is the author of Reputation-Based Governance and Rethinking Corruption. He currently leads two significant research initiatives, the Italian Scalpo Project and the EU-funded Bridge Gap Program. His expertise has been sought by the European Commission, the World Bank, the United Nations, and various Italian government branches, including the Prime Minister's Office and the Anti-Corruption Authority. Gio, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Voy a hablar, mi ponencia será en inglés, pero antes de empezar, permítame decirles en español algunas palabras, que es un placer para mí estar aquí, aunque sea únicamente de manera virtual, y me gustaría también agradecer a los organizadores. Entonces, ojalá hubiera sido posible, pero no ha sido así, y me estoy en Bologna, como en el norte de Italia, que es mi ciudad, la ciudad de la universidad donde trabajo. Bueno, I'm going to switch into English, as promised, and I'm going to present some recent work that I've done together with Lorenzo Crippa, who's at the University of Strathclyde, and Eddie Malesky, who's at Duke University. And the broad topic is going to be cross-border corruption, which has already come up in previous presentations today and also yesterday. So let me just very briefly summarize some highlights of this long story, which began in the early 1970s with the Watergate scandal. And a first very important milestone was the approval of the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act in the United States in 1977, which made it illegal for US corporations to bribe abroad. And that was a big innovation worldwide. It was the first time in human history, we may say. But then immediately, maybe not immediately, but after Ronald Reagan was elected, the political climate in the United States shifted in important ways with respect to the post-Watergate season when Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States. Well, right away, there were voices complaining about these FCPA because the playing field was not even, was not the same for all, and in particular, there were complaints that it was damaging American corporations in their activities abroad, competing abroad. So fairly soon, the United States started, there was a mandate, actually, an official formal mandate to lobby at the international level in order to make it happen worldwide. So as an economist would say, internalize these externalities. And eventually, the United States first made an attempt within the United Nations, which failed. And then eventually in 1999, they were successful when a treaty, the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, is called a convention, but it is really hard law in international law. It's a treaty, whereby a number of countries, OECD countries and more, now I think there are 43 signatures to this convention, got on board and decided also, according to this treaty, they had to actually, in order to comply with the treaty, to introduce the crime of international bribery, whereby the national jurisdictions, it became a crime to bribe foreign officials abroad. Well, it was also immediately clear that there was a problem of enforcement because each country had an interest, selfish interest, not to enforce this treaty and these new laws. And built into the convention, there was a monitoring mechanism whereby the OECD itself was and is the custodian to the treaty, which went through different peer review phases. And there is a consensus that phase 3 that started in around 2010, I will show you the timing soon, marked a rather significant increase in enforcement. However, if you want to summarize these few decades of history of the FCPA, we are facing the typical cliche situation of a glass which is half full and half empty. We have to note that the United States played an important role as a third country enforcer. That is, as we also saw in a previous presentation, they promoted a very extensive interpretation of their jurisdiction, which allowed the United States to actually go after companies which are not headquartered in the United States, as long as they are, you know, as long as they do some type of business in the United States. Let me put it this way. Now, in the introduction yesterday to the conference, the keynote speech, Professor Boni Palivka, you know, I think, if I'm not wrong, she listed among the very bad things, but the news that we received on February the 10th, the United States, following one of the many executive orders by the new Trump administration, decided to pause enforcement of the FCPA. So actually, when I proposed this paper for this conference, it was before this event, and then after that, there was a flurry of attention towards the FCPA. Now it's really timely in a way, even if, again, when I proposed to stop, it was not. So this, you know, the facts, just as a quick reminder, I'm sure that most of you know them, but that this is going to be needed. And actually, I was mentioning phase 3. Let me quickly show the timing for many countries. So some countries started in 2010 all the way to 2019. There are some countries within the signatures of the treaty that have not gone through this. And countries also that have done no enforcement at all. For example, the Russian Federation notoriously hasn't done any enforcement of that, even if they are members of the convention. Okay, so while my work on this topic actually is within a broader project, book was mentioned that I published last year, Thinking Corruption, Cambridge University Press, where, among other things, I reason about the role of this international dimension within what we may call the anti-corruption paradigm, which is today pretty much in crisis. I mean, yesterday, Dr. Palivka mentioned several cases that didn't really work out as imagined. And actually, one of the big case studies in my book is about Brazil, as you can see from the cover of the book, where you have Jair Bolsonaro, actually a cardboard cutout of Jair Bolsonaro, which was taken in 2018 in front of the parliament, 2 towers in the back on the day when he won the elections. And then 2 works which are, whereas the book is really multidisciplinary, 2 works which are quantitative studies one on the effects, very timely study on the effects for stock market valuations of the companies that were involved with the FCPA cases after the announcement of February the 10th. And in case you're interested, you can Google that. It's available on the internet. And the conclusion of that paper, let me just, the highlight is that, in fact, those companies got lucky, and the valuation had a significant and important increase right after following the unexpected decision by the Trump administration to pause enforcement of the FCPA. So this paper, Making Bribery Profitable, again, it's a title which, for reasons that, I think are obvious. The other work, which is the one that I'm going to quickly summarize today, is on so-called leakages in international regimes, which is kind of a technical word. The meaning actually is quite simple. And let me just quickly tell you what these are. So when people who work in international organizations talk about leakages, they mean what occurs when actors, both in and outside of a regime, take actions that undermine its long-term objectives. A simple example, we have international regimes to combat pollution. Now, what may happen is that firms that are subject to this regime, that are in countries that follow these rules, may decide to transfer production to countries that are outside the regime, like in the countries that do not enforce laws limiting pollution. So these actually, in the literature on the studies on ways to mitigate global warming, is a big deal. It's a big area of research because obviously it's an important worry. And more generally, if leakages are very strong, an international regime could even be counterproductive. Now, what does that mean in terms of the Anti-Bribery Convention? Well, in this case, leakages would occur when, for example, companies that are outside of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, for example, companies from China, companies from India, these two countries are not signatories of the convention. They have better opportunities to bribe abroad in a situation where other companies from, Germany, United States, other countries that are members of the conventions, in a way, are limited in corrupting abroad because they fear the threat of prosecution at home. Now, is this a problem? Well, up until now, we only knew for one country, a well-known paper by Jensen and Maleski. Maleski is one of the two co-authors in our study, the study that I'm presenting now, which was published in 2018 in international organizations, but it was only on Vietnam. They made what is called the list experiment there, which is an expensive exercise, which can be made only in one country. I mean, it cannot be made worldwide. So what we managed to do in our study is to present evidence worldwide using a totally different approach and different data. Data that we have used in other studies, and it's a big database that we assembled during many years on cross-border bribes, meaning not only FCPA cases, but cases from all over the world, involving countries that maybe have been prosecuted in France, in Germany, in Italy, you name it. One obvious example would be the famous Siemens case, which that was, yes, it was an FCPA case that was found having paid bribes in several foreign countries. I won't go into the technicalities of this work because the presentation is going to be short, but let me just highlight that the key information in the database is on the country where a case was first enforced. Now, for good reasons, this is a key information because it allows to control for judicial activism. Well, quite obviously, we're going to have more cases in the United States because the United States, before the decision by the current Trump administration, was quite tough in prosecuting cases. Other countries, I mentioned Russia, couldn't care less, didn't do anything. So this particular key information, which you see in bold here, is what allows us to get to identify the effects that we're looking for. And let me also mention that this data have been used previously for in other works, and in particular to compute new measures of corruption. For example, of public officials. It's a measure which is alternative and frankly much better than Transparency International corruption perception index. It's not based on perception as the measured by Transparency International. It's based on, in a way, hard data. That makes a difference. And also firms' propensity to bribe abroad and other studies. Now, another technical part is that in order to estimate leakage, we compute a measure of the degree of competition in third country markets. What is the idea? Well, the idea is that if two countries, say France, which is a compliant country, meaning it's a member of the convention, and China, which is not, they compete a lot, say in Vietnam, then China is going to have a bigger advantage because it exports goods, in this case, which are more similar to the ones that are exported by France, so that if France companies are restrained from bribing in Vietnam, China's companies would take a bigger advantage compared to a situation where they trade in different goods. You know, maybe France sells wine and China sells computers. You know, that would be little competition. Okay. So using this particular measure, which we introduce, this is what we obtain. Well, we obtain that coherently with our hypothesis, we get a stronger effect when the level of competition is high. So this leads us, and of phase 3 of OECD compliance, the peer review. This leads us to support our main conclusion, which is yes, we do find leakage effects statistically significant. You know, technically we would say this, but not only that. When we measure the size of this effect, the effect is substantial. It's not only there, but it's also rather big. This is what we conclude. Now, let me get to the conclusions, which obviously have policy implications, particularly in these days, or at least, you know, maybe not policy implications because it's complicated now to give suggestions to governments on what to do to react to the latest decisions by the US government, but at least to better understand the situation in order to decide. So the United States hoped that the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention would level the playing field and abate negative domestic consequences, domestic externalities of compliance. And in fact, enforcement of the ABC produced these leakages and intended and unintended consequences. Now, these considerations are particularly important after the executive order of February the 10th, halting enforcement of the FCPA. And these decisions certainly arose from worries which our study shows are actually present and justifiable in the sense that indeed there are leakages about American firms' competitiveness. However, we also conclude that this is certainly not the way to go about it. And rather than stepping down on international anti-corruption mandates, reducing bribery, we believe, requires enrolling more countries, not fewer countries, in the Anti-Bribery Convention or similar international treaties, and guaranteeing that they enforce the document seriously. Without such assurance, it is in a situation such as the present one, where we have important players which are not members of the convention, namely the most important of them are China, but also India. Spillovers will likely continue to occur, and in these situations in particular, the February the 10th decision is particularly worrying, and we are now at a serious risk of an unraveling of the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention in a situation where other countries will legitimately at this point have an incentive to react to the decision of the United States by also lowering their enforcement of the Anti-Bribery OECD Convention. Particularly so if, as it may happen, US enforcement will become more selective and target uniquely foreign companies, securities companies, foreign with respect to the United States. This is it. Thank you very much for your attention. And actually, here you have my email address in case of, any questions, follow-ups. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
And I think we're going to hold questions on this till the end of all of our presenters. Let's keep rolling. Okie doke. Abigail, you ready?
Yes. Hello.
Cool, because I'm going to introduce you. Here we go.
Thank
All
you.
right, so Abigail Zislis. Oh boy, this is a day for pronunciation. Abigail Zislis at Georgetown University Law Center. Presentation on Justice Compromised, How Systemic Corruption Hinders Colombia's Victims Law. Abigail Zislis is an attorney and a joint JD and MS in Foreign Service graduate from Georgetown University Law Center. She's currently a federal judicial law clerk. Prior to attending law school, she spent time working in Medellin, Colombia, for an investigative journalism outlet called Cytecron, where she conducted fieldwork investigations on organized criminal groups. There, she developed interest in civil rights, government accountability, and post-conflict transitional justice for victims of civil armed conflicts. All right, Abigail, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I will go ahead and share my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
Yep. Loud and clear.
Great. Thank you so much. So before I thank you so much for the introduction. And before I start my presentation, I would like to thank Professors Sean Hagan and Dr. Scott Guggenheim for their guidance and support on this topic. I'm also grateful to Pablo de Grief and Paula Gaviria Batancur for their insights at the early stages of this topic's development. Now, to launch into my presentation, in 2011, Colombia enacted Law 1448 of Victims and Land Restitution, providing restitution and reparations to victims of the civil armed conflict. The successes and the limitations of this legislation and its implementation serve as a vehicle through which public corruption, as well as anti-corruption strategies in Colombia, can be understood. This presentation will argue that fundamental changes must be made to the existing system by creating stronger accountability mechanisms for the effective enactment of the legislative program. Ratified on June 10th, 2011, Colombia's Victims Law is, in effect, a piece of legislation that serves as a transitional justice tool. It represents a first major attempt by the Colombian government to restore a series of guaranteed rights to affected victims of the civil armed conflict. It's a response to the effects of the internal conflict between the Colombian government and the FARC insurgent group, which resulted in 220,000 deaths, 25,000 disappearances, and the forced displacement of over 5.7 million individuals over the last half century. Now, before I launch into the details of the Victims Law, it's important to understand the nature and the extent of corruption in Colombia for evaluating public policy, and particularly the implementation of the Victims Law and other post-conflict reforms. Corruption in Colombia is not just frequent, it's systemic. Diagnostic measures consistently place Colombia in the lower half of global governance and corruption indices, and public opinion reflects this reality. To understand why corruption has become so entrenched, it's helpful to look at the structural and cultural conditions that enable it. Colombia's long history with organized crime, its reliance on a resource-rich economy, and its fragile post-conflict institutions have contributed to an environment where corrupt behavior has become normalized. Corruption is particularly embedded in two key areas: the extractive industry, where bribery is rampant in licensing and contract awards, and the civil service, where integrity standards are weak and oversight mechanisms are often ineffective. Now, to launch into the legislation itself, Law 1448, under the Victims Law, Colombia's land restitution model includes two types of reparations to compensate victims, one being material restitution, which is the physical return of land, and two being judicial restitution, which provides legal title to that land. This means that even those who didn't formally own their land but were legitimate occupants when they were displaced can receive official property title. This here is significant in part because of land grabbing. Codifying both the physical and legal restoration of property rights is a proper response to the coercive practices carried out by paramilitaries historically and more recently by organized criminal groups, which have exploited weak state systems to displace rural communities. Now, however, despite its comprehensive scope, the government's delivery promise under the legislation has fallen short in practice. Over 90% of registered victims have not received compensation, and distrust in authorities has led to low registration rates in the reparations program. Moreover, only a fraction of land claims since 2011 have been resolved, hindering implementation of law. Now, transitioning to the details behind the implementation of the law, we can see the implementation has been obstructed in part by three major forces. One being decentralized processes, which have created inefficiencies and allowed corruption to flourish at the local level. Two being weak institutions, marked by poor coordination, a lack of political will, and institutional complicity in land fraud. And third, being violent resistance from organized criminal groups, including paramilitary successor organizations that have used threats and intimidation to block restitution efforts and maintain territorial control. Overall, the law's decentralized model, which allocates regional authority to local specialized courts, fails to account for high levels of corruption that have penetrated local court systems in rural regions where both armed paramilitary groups and private actors exercise undue influence over judges vis-a-vis bribery, intimidation, and threats. Now, moving on, I'll explore Colombia's approach to anti-corruption here on a broader level. Colombia has developed a comprehensive anti-corruption strategy combining national laws and international commitments. Key laws like the 2011 Anti-Corruption Statute, the 2016 Transnational Bribery Law, and the 2019 reforms criminalize bribery and promote corporate compliance, mixing punitive enforcement with incentives for self-reporting and transparency. To implement these laws, Colombia has created multiple agencies and initiatives, such as the Transparency Secretariat, the Open Government Index, and the Transparency and Anti-Bribery Observatory to improve coordination, accountability, and public access to information. However, while Colombia certainly does possess the infrastructure for an effective anti-corruption strategy, I argue that it would benefit from mainstreaming its internal control processes, increasing cooperation across state levels, and adopting a set of integrity criteria in the civil service recruitment process. That leads me finally to my overall recommendations. To conclude, Colombia's ongoing fight against corruption requires a multifaceted approach that goes beyond enforcement alone. Based on the challenges identified and lessons from current frameworks, I propose three key recommendations. One being to increase transparency and capacity by strengthening institutional accountability, expanding transparency programs, and embedding rigorous performance management standards in civil service recruitment. I also argue in favor of centralizing land restitution courts and utilizing technology to do so. While certain statutory provisions in the Victims Law could be tightened up to lessen opportunities for corruption, the root of the problem here, as I see it, is not the law, but rather the institutions responsible for enforcing the law, including the local court system. I propose centralization of the specialized land restitution judicial function to minimize local corruption and to protect local judges from external threats. Creating a centralized process for the adjudication of land claims will likely reduce the monopoly power of organized crime and of the local magistrates who often cater to the interests of criminal groups. I also recommend utilizing technology to improve transparency of this proposed centralized body. Lastly, I recommend adopting a non-enforcement approach. Colombia must shift from their punitive enforcement heavy model to one that focuses more on structural reforms and accountability mechanisms. In Colombia's post-conflict context, prosecution alone will not overcome the strong grip that organized crime and paramilitary groups maintain over law enforcement, prosecutors, and the country at large. This concludes my presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Abigail. Really awesome stuff. All right, and again, we're going to hold questions. We have 2 more presentations, and then we'll get into Q&A. Nicholas, are you here? All right, he's ready to go. All right, so Nicholas Soto from Guido Carli, that's what I said. He's going to talk to us about assessing the determinants of public transparency in Chilean municipalities. Nicholas is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at Lucio University. He holds a master's degree in public policy obtained in 2022 at the Hershey School of Governance in Berlin, and a master's degree in criminal law obtained in 2012 at the Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago de Chile. He has previously worked as a lawyer specialized in criminal law, human rights, and judicial systems. His research interest lies in the assessment of anti-corruption policies with a particular emphasis on transparency measures. Let's do it, Nicholas.
Now it's okay? Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I will start. My presentation is called Assessing the Drivers of Transparency in Chilean Municipalities. So very quickly, I'm just starting my PhD. I've been doing this for 6 months. This is a paper I'm currently working on, but I still don't have any results. So basically, I'm going to present to you what is the problem statement, the motivation, a little bit of the research design, and any kind of feedback I can receive from you in any of these aspects is going to be great. Okay, so what's the problem statement? Basically, freedom of information in Latin America. As you can see here, since the early 2000s, there has been a rapid expansion of freedom. Okay, technology is not my friend.
Yeah. I think we can actually do this.
Okay, perfect. So again, since early 2000s, we can see a rapid expansion of freedom of information laws in Latin America. As you can see in the map, right now, almost all countries in Latin America have this kind of legislation. And normally we have 2 types of questions in academia regarding this process. First, what are the drivers of transparency policies? This means why countries in Latin America are enacting this type of legislation. And second, what is the de facto level of implementation of these measures? In Latin America, we are specialists in enacting laws, thinking that magically this is going to solve our issues, and then we can see that implementation is a different game. So this is a big part of research right now in academia. My investigation is going to be about the first question, what are the drivers of transparency policies, but particularly at the local level, because we can see there is a big gap in investigation regarding this topic. Okay, so I'm going to focus on Chile. First, because I'm Chilean, and second, because Chile is a very interesting case, and I'm going to explain this in the next slides. So very quickly, what is the legislation situation in Chile right now? We have this law, transparency law, since 2009. And this is a very standard legislation when it comes to transparency. So basically it has these 2 different components. Active transparency, which basically means the legal obligation for permanent disclosure of information, and this in regards to organizational structure, decision-making processes, and budget. And a second component, which is passive transparency. This basically means that authorities have the obligation to disclosure information when this has been requested by citizens using the official channels. These obligations can be applied both to central and local administration. A very important part of the Chilean legislation and something that basically has called the attention of scholars is the creation of a very strong body that is in charge of overseeing and enforcing the law. So it happens many times in Latin America. You can maybe you have experience with this, that we have these very beautiful laws, but when it comes to having an organism, a body that is actually enforcing this legislation, it becomes more difficult. In the case of Chile, we have this. The Council of Transparency is a very strong body, has a lot of faculties. So this has been a very important part of this legislation. So what's the situation? Is Chile a success story? I put this picture because it's the typical picture we show other people from other countries, this very modern and successful nation. Are we successful in this aspect? According to Open Government Partnership and, for instance, Anti-Corruption Resource Center, we are a successful case of transparency policies. So, for instance, in this report from 2015, they say Chile is a successful open government reformer. Flaxo has the same opinion. So, for instance, in this report from 2024, they exemplify with Chile and Uruguay as both countries with very successful transparency policies. Also, it's very important the role of the Council of Transparency. So, for instance, in a paper by Mikener in 2015, we can see that 50% of the evaluations of transparency made by governments were made by the Council of Transparency from Chile. But let's go to the problem. What is going on with municipalities? So what about the local level? We can see here that the reality is very different. So, for instance, we have this report from the Council of Transparency, and they basically find that it exists significant differences between components of transparency. What they are looking now is a disaggregation of the components of transparency. And as you can see here, the bottom 5 components are actually the components that we care about. So, for instance, when it comes to public procurement, budgetary information, and acts and resolutions with effects on third parties, this is the worst part of transparency with municipalities. So the conclusion of this report is that high corruption risk areas are the least transparent at the municipal level. This is the third caveat that I wanted to show with you, regarding this successful story of Chile. So why is it important? It is important because, for instance, a very recent report by Libertad en Desarrollo, this is a think tank in Chile, they did this corruption perception survey and they asked citizens, in a scale of 1 to 10, how corrupt do you think the following institutions are? And this is no surprise, municipalities are perceived as the most corrupt institutions in Chile. So that's the problem statement and what I would like to investigate. So first, I would like to investigate this difference in compliance and transparency between administrative levels. So why the central level is more transparent than the local level. To construct the hypothesis for this investigation, for this question, I want to use this report I was speaking about, Fontaine, and they find that transparency implementation is conditioned by 2 components. First, the mode of coordination of the state. So they create this difference between a centralized mode of coordination and a decentralized mode of coordination. And also the implementation style. So they make this distinction between coercive and consensus building. I'm not going to go deep into this because it's a whole book, but taking into account this theoretical framework, I propose this hypothesis. The variance in transparency between central and municipal levels are explained by the centralized coordination and coercive implementation style adopted by the Chilean state. In very simple terms, the Chilean state implementing transparency. They didn't work with municipalities. They didn't work with non-state actors. And basically, we have a very top-down approach to the implementation of transparency measures. Second, I'm really interested not only in the differences between the central and the local level, but also the differences between municipalities. So the question is why municipalities in Chile adopt different transparency policies. It is important to say that many times municipalities, they say we don't have the money or resources, but actually what the evidence says is that, okay, resources is very important aspect, but also other factors are influencing the differences in transparency between municipalities. So basically, for the creation or the construction of the hypothesis for this research question, I want to draw from first a paper by Javier Kretschmer. She explored the social and economic factors influencing the implementation of transparency measures. Another paper by Piña and Avellaneda. They also want to explore the differences between municipalities, but basically focusing on enforcement mechanisms and central government guidance. And third, a paper by Berliner is called The Political Origins of Transparency. And basically what he explains is that a very important factor is electoral uncertainty. He's speaking about the national level, but he's saying why countries implement transparency measures. Basically, governments in highly competitive political systems, when they see that they have uncertainty about electoral results, they basically say, let's go full transparent about this, because that way they are going to have information about how the opposition is going to work in the next mandate. So I'm finishing with this. Basically, the hypothesis is that implementation of transparency is influenced by socioeconomic factors, enforcement factors, and political factors. And this is my last slide, methods and data. So for the first research question, I want to use qualitative analysis using process tracing. The data is going to be semi-structured interviews with authorities, but also the review of documents, reports, and legislation. And for the second question, I want to use a quantitative analysis, a very simple regression. The data for the dependent variable transparency basically is the Council of Transparency, who is evaluating this since 2012. And for the independent variable is political and social and economic data, and is collected by several central agencies in Chile. And that's it.
So our last presenter is Heidi Smith from the Universidad Iberoamericana. The effects of corruption on budgeting and financial management in Mexican local governments. Dr. Heidi Jane Smith is a research professor at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City and an affiliated faculty member of George Mason University. She brings extensive experience throughout Latin America as an academic and consultant, collaborating with organizations such as the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Organization of American States, and the OECD. Dr. Smith's career also includes valuable public service within the U.S. government, where she held positions at the Department of State and the Inter-American Foundation. Dr. Smith, are you with us?
Yep, you ready? Okay, great. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me, even though I'm not physically in Bogota. I would have loved to gone to some of the restaurants in Bogota with you, but I'm right now on sabbatical in Washington, D.C., so I appreciate it. Is it better to speak in English or Spanish? What's the audience?
What do you prefer?
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, your call. Your call.
Okay, I can go faster in English, so I'll do that. So I'm a political scientist. My PhD is in public administration, and my colleague is a former, his name is Gabriel Puron Cid, and he's a former auditor and budgeter in Mexico, and his PhD is in public administration. And as you know, our objective here is to look at the interaction between states and municipal public finances. In Mexico, we're looking at specifically the influences of how people perceive corruption and how good the public finances are. So we're interested in this interaction, the relationship between the economic performance and the fiscal condition within governments. And as you probably know, Mexico has had a long history of corruption. And when you say Mexico to anyone internationally, they say, oh, it's the most corrupt country in the world. Well, we know that that's not necessarily true. We also know that Andrés Manuel López Obrador came to power as a leftist politician who proposed to have anti-corruption reforms. Since 2000 and the opening of democracy, Mexico's become has more political changes in its partisan systems, and that generally openness of democracy, one would think that there'd be less corruption. Here we can see just a quick the corruption perception index by Transparency. It's noteworthy that it's at 29 and the region is 43, so it's less. It's a better in terms of its corruption ratings, but yet it's scored at 126 out of 180 that they evaluated in 2023. And we also know that, in the Latin barometer, 44% of people thought corruption increased in the last 12 months, and 34% of public service users paid bribes in other contexts. So there's a lot of problems in Mexico about bribery and diversion of public funds and effective prosecution. We've looked a lot about lawfare. We've seen the new judiciary reforms that are happening and the new elections with the magistrates and all the legal system, and just the questioning of the legal authority and the management of all of that's happening. So one would wonder if this is a continued effort of anti-corruption. Is it less corrupted, more corrupt, and then how do the public finances sit into this situation? So I center the chapter that I shared with the committee that sometimes there are corrupt acts, but oftentimes we don't have laws that are sufficient, and the policies themselves aren't sufficient to indicate what's illegal. So I brought up the specific case of Moira, who was the governor of Coahuila. He was very astute in 2012, and he went to 5 different commercial banks, took out money with the state guarantees, and financed his political campaign. Then he went out of office, and his brother Hector came into office and used those funds also for his election. Because Mexico has a state, this is a case of electoral fraud, electoral abuse of power. It demonstrates that there are state and local governments that do have abused money and public influence for themselves. But at the same time, we have a lot of efforts that have been done by legislative reforms. And here I'm thinking specifically about budgeting and finance, that we have, at least throughout the last 20 years, improved the governance systems in terms of fiscal responsibility laws, budgeting laws, increasing national accounting standards, creating a financial discipline law in 15 that applied to states, in 16 and municipalities in 18. I didn't even touch here. We have a national corruption law, anti-corruption system that's being reformed, and FOIA. If everyone's familiar with FOIA, we had the transparency laws that were created in the early 2000s, as some of the most innovative. Some of those are being backslid and reformed. But in general, we have a lot of progression towards a more stringent public financial management system and a stringent legal framework for undermining to correct for these laws. The biggest problem we have in terms of public finance, to be specific, is that we don't have a lot of, even though there's laws that are created, they're not necessarily implemented. And then other times, because Mexico is a federation, states don't have to, oftentimes there's secondary laws that the federal government has along with the states. So states have fiscal autonomy, but they don't necessarily apply all of the budgeting laws that the national government have, and less so for local governments. So the research we're doing here is we're looking at the fiscal space, and it's similar to the first presentation that we heard in this section, which I think the gentleman was really speaking about in the US, talking about the political budget cycles. But here we're looking at how this perception of this fiscal space exists. What is the fiscal capacity of governments, local and state governments? And then also, what is the fiscal structure that that a country could have that have perceived levels of corruption? There's a really famous piece by Pierre Leon, who's at Colmex. He's a French man that worked at the World Bank. And he said that with more decentralization efforts, with more people in the budgeting process, there's more likelihood to have more corruption. So early on, and actually in the 2000s in Mexico, we had a lot of newspaper journalism that said, oh, this person's taking this money, this, and this. So there was a perceived perception of higher levels of corruption and lower levels of government taking more money. But at the same time, it was consolidating these budgeting practices. The other question we have is, is there intentional misuse of funds, or is it that maybe laws aren't stringent enough to actually capture that Moida case, for example, that it obviously was not appropriate for the man to go to 5 different commercial banks for his own personal loans. But it's kind of like the George Santos case in the United States, where of course he can't run on his wrong background, but he did, and he won, right? So politics and corruption sometimes go hand in hand. And then lastly, we're looking at these accounts for transaction costs. So we're interested in the understanding of, does this fiscal space or the understanding of the politics and the interaction with the public management of money account for more or less transaction costs? And how can we look at this overarching in the larger amount of the economy? I think this is a broader question. We don't actually attend to that last piece, but the first 3 we do. So when we're looking at the corruption literature, the really great thing is we're thinking about rent-seeking and rent-seeking behavior. We're thinking about it in terms of personal benefits and reciprocal actions. In the United States, we have a really nice database of patterns of public officials and how they actually have been fined or imprisoned because of their corruption or bribery that they've done. So you can do really nice statistical analysis. A couple of my colleagues, Lou, Mixell, and Tima have also done the same thing, looking at the 3 cycles of the budget, revenue, expenditures, and then debt issuance, and whether those influence the amounts of corruption or not. You can look at distorted resources. So you can think of during the budgeting process, you can, for example, public officials can use appropriate procurement processes, but at the end of the day, they can abuse those services by taking out loans or inflating prices. Those are the transaction costs. Mauro does a nice piece on looking at the corruptive conducts of distorting public expenditures. There's also studies on public officials using various dimensions of economic performance, like growth, investments, and infrastructure. And you also can see there's the relationship between corruption and the political factors. So here we're really focusing on how strong is the public's fiscal space or the financial sustainability of the fiscal condition within where public money manages and operates within Mexico. So what's the difference between fiscal condition and financial condition and fiscal space? So the financial condition is oftentimes used by public managers to think about the fiscal health of a state entity or a budget. So they're thinking about liabilities, expenditures, incomes, and cash flow, and the assets that they receive. Whereas the fiscal condition is really thinking about the fiscal policy, which is the government's able to generate and manage the revenue and allocation of those expenditures, to various purposes. So here we're not thinking about the financial management, but we're thinking about the fiscal condition. So oftentimes economists integrate these concepts and don't disaggregate them. So for example, when we think about fiscal sustainability, it's oftentimes an economics-based argument thinking about debt and debt issuance over the financial condition of the longer term loans, creating that fiscal space for fiscal policy. Now, those are similar terms, but they mean different things to different people. And so it's the difference between an economist looking at the fiscal policy and an auditing person that looks maybe at the financial condition of that. So here we provide a model, and this is the basis of the research, is we're really trying to understand, if we think about the fiscal condition, that's that middle circle here, we're really trying to understand how are the contextual factors influencing the way that public financial management works in Mexico. Are these just subsystems, or how are they interconnected? So we're looking at the financial sustainable framework and thinking about, we're defining it into the long-term liabilities and the short-term perspective of the fiscal condition. So that how these contextual factors influence this fiscal condition, which is that the small circle here in the middle. So the key considerations is we're trying to understand the way in which, and we're not oblivious that corruption happens in Mexico. We're trying to understand its impact on the public finances. So it's not that we're looking at to see that each individual corrupt piece of corruption that happens, that would be like the white noise when you're doing regression analysis. We know that there are different times in history that people take money or abuse their power, but we're trying to understand how this influences this fiscal condition in that middle circle of the public finances. So let's just keep going. We've got several hypotheses of this fiscal condition. We're looking to see if the municipal levels is associated with fiscal condition corruption at the municipal level. We're looking to see if states or the corruption of public officials affect the municipal government, fiscal condition of the municipal governments. We're looking to see if there's a relationship between the state governments associated with local governments, the municipal governments. By controlling for everything else, we want to see if there's no difference between corruption of public officials on state and local governments. And then we want to see if the larger contextual frame of economic and social factors also influence the fiscal condition of municipal and local governments. We use a data set of 277 out of 2,500 municipal governments and 28 out of 32 state governments. The reason for this is because our key dependent variable is perceptions of corruption. And so it's a limited data set but it's statistically representational of all of Mexico. And we're using a structural equation model, and we have years of 18, 19, and 21. In 2020, they didn't do it because of COVID. And this is not a causal model where we're trying to figure out if corruption affects the outcome of the fiscal condition. We're looking at the interrelationship between the two. So it's not, so we're trying to understand the relationship between whose perception to what, okay? And so we think of this fiscal condition as confirming this multi-level nature, that when you're in a federal system, that you're going to have interactions between the perceptions of corruption at state and municipal and federal levels. Here's our data set. Here's
about 1 minute left.
Okay, perfect. So these are the key variables: revenue, corruption, independent like contextual is the corruption, victimization, personal income, years of schooling, active labor, unemployment, and poverty. And we do some factor analysis, and we find basically two levels. First, we're looking at the top level, municipal level, and the bottom level, state level. And what we find is people's perception of corruption at the state level is positive and significant, but it's negative and non-significant at the municipal level. But when we include rating agencies as kind of a proxy for evaluating this, we see corruption victimization is negative, and also at the municipal, negative and insignificant. So here's the loading of the variables. Here we're looking at, this is the state, these negative variables here. So corruption is not necessarily, it's negatively affecting the fiscal condition. But here we have state, it's positively affecting the fiscal condition. Municipal is negative at both levels. So just to conclude, we're looking at the relationship of fiscal condition on state and municipal governments, and for understanding the fiscal sustainability framework. This examination is conducted at the municipal level of governments and exercising the endogenous and exogenous variables of levels of government, state, and municipal. Research also contributes to the exploration of the measurement of corruption on fiscal condition. And where we see that there's overall impacts of corruption at the state level, and there's less of the perception data at the local level. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm very interested in your comments. Thank you so much. Hopefully I'm out of here.
Good, thank you. All right, so we've got about 18 minutes for Q&A. We got to stop at 4 for our coffee break. So if you have a question in the room, raise your hand. Awesome, come on down. And then if you are online, feel free to raise your hand and or throw it in the chat. All right.
So my question is for Nicholas. Just to clarify, your hypothesis is that perhaps the first hypothesis is that perhaps for the coercive of the central state is not being so successful in the local transparency policies. Is this because it's not mandatory to implement the same kind of policies, even if it's coercive? Or I'm not sure about that. Or what could be the other option if it's not coercive to be mandatory of this kind of policy? Thank you.
Un comentario para Nicolás y una pregunta para Heidi. Es un trabajo súper chévere, quería motivarte nada más porque es muy, muy interesante. Darte una recomendación de argumentar, de favorecer la argumentación de por qué Chile. Normalmente se estudian los casos peores, normalmente se estudia inclusive en economía y en sociología aquellos casos que siempre son como los peores. Y Chile creo que es justo una oportunidad para estudiar aquello que supuestamente es lo que no es peor o un buen desempeño. Entonces, nada, motivarte porque me parece una buena idea. Otro comentario respecto al tema es que tal vez lo que podría estar detrás en la diferencia respecto a lo que encuentras a nivel regional y nacional es básicamente un nivel de formalización. Hay autores que argumentan que es porque simplemente a nivel local es más difícil formalizar los mecanismos anticorrupción y es por eso básicamente que vas a ver más corrupción o más percepción de corrupción a niveles regionales. Pero voy a ir en contra de esa hipótesis porque lo que está detrás de esa idea desde mi perspectiva es que básicamente la idea anticorrupción es simplemente modernizar un país. Y eso es muy criticable desde varios aspectos, desde varios puntos de vista. Podemos conversar de eso si quieres. Heidi, una pregunta. I don't know if it's okay in English or in Spanish. What is your... Sorry?
What do you think?
Okay. what is the connection that you see between the evolution of the fiscal consolidation or the fiscal approach that you're taking regarding austerity? Because if we follow the hypothesis here, maybe we fall in the conclusion that at the end of the day, less corruption implies less expenditures. And that's precisely what I'm trying to explore in my investigation, that if we conclude that the root of the problem of corruption is a fiscal condition in a country, the classic solution would be just reduce expenditures. And that is kind of problematic. It's just a general question. Thank you.
Gracias. This is for Lucio. Please don't hang me because of this question. But I was, while you were presenting, I was wondering if what would be your opinion on having probably, this is gonna sound really bad, but two types of countries, right? Like the first one being the ones, for example, from the OECD, where they comply with anti-bribery legislation, and try to thinking about the US right now and the decisions they are making in a kind of pragmatic way, thinking about business, how to do business worldwide. Maybe having these two types of countries, the first one trying to keep this attempt to become or to still being transparent, and other countries, this sounds bad because they're gonna probably be from third world countries which do not comply with this type of legislation, and then trying to pull this second group of countries to become more transparent and to penalize bribery abroad. So it's just a thought that I had while you were presenting. And I just have a quick comment for Nicolás as well. En la Universidad Católica de Temuco hay el Centro de Políticas Públicas. Emilio Moya está dirigiéndolo y ellos trabajan muchísimo el nivel local, levantando información justamente de temas de transparencia, de gobernabilidad, etc. Entonces, tal vez puedan ser unos buenos aliados para tu investigación. Thank you.
It looks like we got a question online from Nicholas.
That's me. Hey, congrats. Great presentation. I have a very super simple question for Nicolas. So I led your research, and I'm curious to know if you think that this 4-year term for the majors in Chile will show any pattern, like probably in the early on years, probably the majors will be more motivation to show the information because they are presenting information from the previous mayor, not from their own administration. So I'm curious to know about your perception on that. But congrats, it's a great research and great panel, by the way.
Okay, so I'm going to try to answer these questions. The first one was why this coercive implementation style adopted by the Chilean state will have an impact in the implementation of transparency measures in municipalities. So the basic idea is that when the Chilean state was designing these policies, basically there was very little room for instance, subnational governments to have a say. So basically, and this is it's a big issue in general in Chile, that we design policies that should be implemented by subnational governments, assuming some kind of like homogeneous state, like all municipalities are the same, all municipalities have the same resources, and then we realize it's not like that. So that's a problem. When you're designing a policy that should be implemented by municipalities, probably you should put also municipalities in the table to discuss this. This legislation is mandatory for municipalities. The Council of Transparency has said that they expect 100% of a compliance because the general rule is transparency. So obviously, it is very worrying that, for instance, when it comes to budget and also procurement, compliance is so low. Why Chile? I think Chile is a very interesting case, first because, as you said, and I think also in your presentation you were making this point, when it comes to anti-corruption policies and transparency is one of these measures, we are importing this. So this is something that it was some policy that comes from Europe, North America, and we basically try to put in place these kinds of policies because there's certain conversation or there's certain influence by international organizations, etc. Chile should be the perfect country for the implementation of this. Because when you see, for instance, governance quality, the quality of institutions, Chile should be the perfect country. And then you realize that when it comes to implementation of this, actually it's not this beautiful image I was showing, but it's something much more nuanced. So that's why I think Chile is an interesting place. And for the last question regarding majors. So the political factor, basically the idea is that why majors will have the incentive to publish more information. So basically we need to think this from a political point of view. So I will say, it is likely that, for instance, when the mayor is starting his or her mandate, probably he's going to be more eager to publish information about the former mayor. But also an idea to apply these political factors as some element that is being taken into account by municipalities at the moment of publishing information is, I want to have information about the next government or the next party that is going to control the municipality, because that is going to allow me to, for instance, criticize or maybe make some statement about the state of accountability of these next local governments. But I think that the comment is very good, and I think I will take it into consideration, Nicole.
All right, we got about 6 minutes left. Any other questions in the room? Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi.
Oh, go for it. Yeah, sure.
I don't know. Should I answer to the question or there are other questions? I didn't get it. I'm sorry.
You can go ahead and answer the question. Yeah.
All right, I'll be quick anyway. So thank you very much for the question. Well, in fact, right from the beginning of the OECD ABC in 1998, there was a process of enlargement. So more countries got on board. Now, certainly before the decision of the current administration to pause the enforcement, the situation was less than ideal. So as I said, it was half full, half empty glass. And also, it should be noted that the United States, with all its shortcomings, had played a very important positive role, and particularly the expansive interpretation of jurisdiction. In a way, they played, the cop of the world, forcing other countries to step up their enforcement. So it was not ideal, but it was to some degree effective. Now, the risk now is really to go in the opposite direction of what we would need. I mean, I agree, we should certainly strive to have more countries on board, and particularly the big ones, which are missing, and China in particular, and pressure all the countries to be more effective in enforcing the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. We've just taken, the United States has just taken precisely the opposite direction. And this is simply not going to be good. Eventually, I think it's not even going to be good for the United States, because eventually, if the whole thing unravels, other countries are going to do the same and lower enforcement, and then we go back to the good old days before 1978, and when corruption, cross-border corruption was rampant and checked, but also with a big moral cost. I mean, let's not forget the positive role that paradoxically in those years played the presence of the Soviet Union. The United States is quite clear. If you read the debate that led to the FCPA, the Church Commission, for example, they were worried because in the Soviet Union, after the Watergate scandal and the Lockheed scandal, they had a field day condemning how corrupt was global capitalism under the aegis of the United States. So it was really a disciplining effect, which I'm not defending the Soviet Union, certainly, but it was a disciplining effect that in those years had a positive effect to put a restraint on global capitalism. And now, unfortunately, there is no such positive effect, so that Donald Trump can feel free to, just don't care about any ethical concerns in pretty much justifying cross-border corruption, international corruption. Thank you.
Would you like me to answer my question? Or did you?
Yes, please.
Or did you have more in the room?
No, it's just you.
Oh, okay. So I think this is really great. And I think you made the presentation yesterday about fiscal condition and just spending less money. I think that it'd be useful to increase the definition of what you mean by fiscal condition. And when we think of public financial management, we're thinking about, and one of the things that actually Andrés Manuel López Obrador did in his administration was consolidate his finance and actually created independent offices to manage the budget within the different agencies of his government. And so that consolidation sometimes correlates with less extra expenditures, but he also just had more control over his budget. Okay, that's at the federal level. At the local level, when we're looking at financial condition, we're typically thinking about it, financial solvency, and that solvency is really important. And oftentimes that seems to be just less expenditures, but in reality, you're managing the way in which the budget is much more rigorous. So, like for example, revenue per capita, total revenues over expenditures, looking at the intergovernmental relations, thinking about budget solvency, how much you're actually spending and how much you have at the end of the fiscal year, and how you're incorporating that money long term. And then like long term, long budget solvency, you're thinking about your debt servicing. And so debt servicing can be perceived as less expenditures. One of the things the Mexican government did also during Andrés Manuel is they just renegotiated their debt in longer terms. So maybe the debt was cheaper, or they were spending less, but in reality they were spending it less over a longer period of time. And so these different levels of solvency, I think, are fundamental when you're thinking about more austerity. And that's not a correlation. And you have to think more succinctly about that solvency issue, and not just say, oh yeah, they're spending less. No, they might be spending it less in longer terms, or they might be spending less by controlling the budget more. So the financial management of the money is not necessarily spending less or making it more efficient. Thanks.
Right on the dot, 4 o'clock. All right, folks, taking a 15-minute coffee break. Thanks to all our presenters. See you soon.